Hi everyone. Let me apologize in advance because my voice is a little, creaky. But I'm here to introduce Professor Joyce. So Professor Joseph Joyce is a professor of economics at Wellesley College, where he holds the M. Margaret Ball Chair of International Relations. He also serves as the faculty director of the Madeleine Korbel Albright Institute for Global Affairs. Professor Joyce grew up in Brooklyn, New York, and he received a BSFS degree in international affairs from Georgetown University's School of Foreign Service. He then went on to pursue an MA and a PhD in economics from Boston University. In his last semester at Georgetown, Professor Joyce enrolled in a course on international economics, which he found fascinating. It granted him a new perspective on the interactions that exist between nations and has since then informed his work on topics in international finance, such as the policies of the International Monetary Fund and the incidence of financial crises. Professor Joyce also has a blog on financial globalization that I encourage you all to freely check out. His research deals with issues in financial globalization. His book, The IMF and Global Financial Crises, Phoenix Rising, was published in 2012 by Cambridge University Press, and a Chinese edition of this book was published in 2015. His published articles have appeared in journals such as the Journal of International Money and Finance, Review of International Economics, Open Economies Review, Journal of Development Economics, Economics and Politics, Journal of Macroeconomics, Journal of Macroeconomics, Review of World Economics and World Development. He is a member of the editorial boards of the Review of International Organizations and the Journal of International Commerce, Economics and Policy. Professor Joyce came to Wellesley to teach on a part-time basis 35 years ago and has not left since. And this might be because his wife went to Mills College, which is a women's college in Oakland, California, or because he has two daughters, both in college, one who attends Scripps College, a women's college in Southern California, and the other who is in her first year at Connecticut College. For all those who are wondering, this is what Professor Joyce has to say about the Albright Institute. And I quote, "I thought it was an opportunity to do something unique at Wellesley that would allow me to work with some extraordinary students and faculty. It has been that much and more. Please help me welcome Professor Joyce."
Thank you, Crystal, though I suspect you told them more than they ever wanted to know about me. Before we start, I noticed on the screen it points out that I do have the Margaret Ball Chair in International Relations. And because Professor Murphy is here, I thought I would just say a word or two about that. Margaret Ball was a professor at Wellesley College in political science back in the 1940s, 50s maybe. And I'm going to guess, Craig can correct this, that someone later on made a donation to the college to endow a chair in the name of Professor Ball. And that simply means that there's a dedicated pot of money to help pay the salary of whoever holds the chair. And it's a very nice honor that the college gives. I inherited the chair from Professor Murphy, who had been the M. Margaret Ball Chair, Professor of International Relations. And it isn't that they threw him out. Okay, they weren't angry at him. Instead, he got bumped up a level to receive the Betty Friedoff Chair in political science. And the reason why that was free was because our friend and colleague, Rob Paulberg, just retired from last year. So there was a little rematching of the things. The reason I wanted to mention it is this past spring, Joanne and I were down in Washington to visit Secretary Albright to start talking about this year's program. And Joanne very kindly told Secretary Albright about the honor that I was about to get. And her made a kind of a funny face at first. And I wasn't quite sure, Joanne, what was going on. And then she told us the story. Margaret Ball had been a professor of hers when she was a student in the 1950s at Wellesley College. She remembered Margaret Ball very, very well. In fact, she still has a textbook written by Professor Ball with her own notes, Madeleine Albright's notes written in the margins. And she intends to give that book to the Wellesley when she finally does give up her books and some of her other personal possessions. So I was just very touched by that. And Joanne and I were just very struck by that story, that the circle in a sense is unbroken, that this professor back in the 1950s teaches Madeleine Albright, and that Madeleine Albright's book is passed on to Wellesley College, and there's a chair set up, and that first Craig and then I get that particular chair. So it's kind of a nice story about Wellesley College. Okay, so we're here today to talk about global inequality, trends, causes, impact, and solutions. And the question mark doesn't mean I don't quite know what to talk about. It means that I'm not so sure about the solutions. And you'll see why I have that question mark there. So before we go into detail, I thought it'd be worth motivating the talk. In case you don't think it's an interesting topic, I hope I can convince you it is. So on the screen are two people who are very much in the news. On the left, Senator Bernard Sanders of Vermont. On the right, Mr. Trump. And as you well know, they are both running for the nominations of the Democratic and Republican parties. And you might think there's not a whole lot to unite them, but I'm going to make the claim that, in fact, I think there is. And the claim is based on the fact that you have on the one hand a self-avowed socialist, and on the other hand a businessman who has never held office, each having rather respective followings on the two parties. And I don't think that's a coincidence that's happening this year. And it would not have happened 10, 20 years ago. And the reason why I think it's not a coincidence is that we have had inequality in this country, and we'll give you some data and numbers in a few minutes. But I think part of their appeal is to people who feel that on a very personal basis and are looking for some type of answer. And so they turn to these people who are not part of the mainstream and turn to them for answers that are not coming out of the mainstream of either party. It's not just the United States. So here's a little mini political quiz. Who's the gentleman on the left? Anybody, please? Anybody know who the gentleman on the left is, besides Craig and me? I'm going to mispronounce the name, Jeremy Corbyn. And he has just been elected head of the Labour Party in Britain. And he very much is seen as being on, the left wing, and a surprise choice in some ways. And again, someone who would not have been elected head of a major party maybe 10 years ago. But his appeal clearly is to people who feel somewhat disenfranchised. And I hope you know who the woman on the right is. Anyone? Louder, please. Because I can't pronounce it. Thank you. Marine Le Pen. Thank you for saying that, because I wouldn't dare try to pronounce her name. And she is head of the National Front in France. And that is a party which is seen as relatively right-wing and has been rising in popularity to the horror of the other political parties in France. So again, we see this phenomenon that people who would have been seen as fringe candidates not too long ago are now seen as very credible and as having followings in these respective parties in these countries. Okay? So that's why I think inequality is important. That is affecting the very substance of political life, not just in this country, but in many other countries as well. So what I'd like to do this morning is, first of all, simply give you a bit of an overview, discuss some of the basic facts and trends about globalization. Number two, talk about how globalization itself and technology might be responsible for the inequality that we'll be talking about in the first part. And I'll give you a very brief summary of some of the work that's been done in economics. But really the third part is where I think things will get interesting. Talk about the impact on society. And I'm very pleased that Professor Murphy has agreed to stay behind for my talk, because I really want to open it up on that point. Okay? And you'll see there really is no consensus, that there's a lot of stuff that we can talk about, and there's no one right answer. And then, as I said, talk about some of the policies that have been proposed, and you'll see why I personally am dubious. I hope maybe you can convince me of the opposite, but again, very much open up to discussion. So if you'll bear with me for the first part, we'll do the basic overview, some of the research that has been done, and then talk about just why this matters to society and what we might be able to do about it. And we might even come back to the presidential campaigns, because again, this very much is part of what's being talked about. Okay, so let's get started. And I did ask you to read a short article from The Economist, and I reread it last night, and it really is a nice overview of inequality. And so if you're interested in the topic, I would say you may want to read that if you haven't. And that article, in turn, was part of a special issue of The Economist on inequality. So it literally is the first part, and then it's followed by other articles. So you certainly can go back and get that issue, and you'll find out a lot about it. So we're going to do some basic economics. Bear with me. It won't hurt anybody, okay? So the Lorenz curve is what the measure of inequality is going to be based on. And the Lorenz curve is a very simple thing, I think, to explain. As you can see, we have a horizontal axis going from your left to the right that shows the total population, and a vertical axis that shows total income. So imagine that here's my little mini economy. And I asked these guys to come up to the front of the room, and I ordered them by income level. So here's Brianne, and she happens to be the poorest member of society, so I put her all the way at the beginning over here. and then I have people line up by their income, and so Kat's the next poorest, so she's next, and on and on and on until finally we come to Michelle, who happens to be the richest person, and she's all the way at the end of the line. So we've ordered people by income level. Then we go back to the first person and we say, well, how much of national income do you receive? National income being this mini economy. And because she's the poorest person, probably it's not going to be very much. So let's make up a figure, 0.1%, really tiny amount, okay? So that's her share. So on the vertical axis now, we find where 0.1 is. So we have the first person receives 1% of the total income. Then we go to the next person who might be Kat here, and we say, how much do you make? And she receives a little bit more than Brianne does, but again, she's pretty poor. So if she's 0.1, maybe she's 0.15. Add them together and we have 0.25. So the first two people account for 1/4 of all the income. That's what we're doing. Now imagine we continue to go along, and clearly now we come to people who are doing better and better, till finally we come at the end to Michelle, who's the richest person, and we ask her how much of national income does she get. And when we add her amount to all the previous, now we have 100%. So we have all of income being chopped up among the members of our economy, okay? And what we get is called the Lorenz Curve. Now imagine two purely hypothetical extreme situations. Imagine that in my little economy over here, it just so happened that everybody actually received the exact same amount of income. So in a sense, it wouldn't matter how I lined them up. Michelle could have been at the front and Brianne at the other end because they all received the amount. If that were true, and if I was to plot the Lorenz curve, I'd get a straight line. Because as I go along the horizontal axis, every time I get the exact same additional amount of income. And so you would have a world of total equality as shown by that straight line. Hypothetical situation number two, complete opposite. The first 99% of my society receives 0% income. Hypothetical, okay? And then we come to Michelle at the end, who's the richest person, and she gets all of it. Well, the Lorenz curve in that case would be a straight line along the horizontal line until you finally come to the very last observation when it would jump up. So those are the two extremes, complete equality, complete inequality. And as you can imagine, when we actually go out and plot Lorenz curves for different societies, they fall somewhere in between, okay? So there's a hypothetical curve that would represent some type of society, okay? So imagine doing that for different societies and then using that information to derive what's called the Gini Coefficient. And the Gini Coefficient, as I hope you can tell, simply is a measure of the area of the actual Lorenz curve for some actual society at a point of time as a proportion of what would be a world of total inequality. So as you can see, it simply is the pink area divided by the total of the pink and the blue area. So in a world of total inequality, what would the Lorenz curve look like? Again, in total inequality. So Simone, what would the number be?
So on the bottom, it'd be flat, and then at the right end, it would be a perfectly straight line.
So what would the Gini coefficient be, though, if you were to calculate it? In a world of total equality? Zero. Because then the pink area wouldn't exist, and everything would be the blue area, okay? And of course, to the opposite, you can guess what the Gini coefficient would be. In a world of total inequality, the Gini coefficient would be 1. So again, most societies are going to fall somewhere in between the 0 and the 1. So I'm just going to throw up some data. Don't worry about memorizing numbers, okay? But to give you a sense of what the actual data look like. One thing you will notice is that the richer economies usually have lower Gini coefficients than the poorer economies. So again, I simply wanted to give you some data just to kind of go down the table. So Europe and the US runs between 0.23 and 0.38. There's Norway, pretty equal country, 0.23, okay? There's the US at 0.36, probably is 0.37 actually today, okay? Jump to Asia, you'll see it range now. Notice the numbers are creeping up a bit, 0.28 to 0.47, so it's a bit higher. There's China, there's India, okay? Do Latin America and the Caribbean, again, the numbers are moving up a bit more. Brazil is known for having problems with inequality, so that number did not surprise me at all. Mexico a bit lower. And in Africa, not surprisingly, you have a really diverse situation, from relatively low numbers in Nigeria to much higher numbers, and there's the Central African Republic just as an example. So there's a really diverse experience there. Okay? So that's what the Gini coefficient is. So you can plot it and you compare different countries to say, well, one country seems to be more equal than the other. Okay. Once you've done the work of doing it, you might then raise the question, what's happening over time, okay, to any particular country? And what would we expect to happen? Well, again, the article mentions this, but I thought it'd be fun for you to see it. The Kuznets Curve. By the way, the goal of any economist is to have a curve named after you, okay? That shows that you've really done something important, okay? So I don't have mine yet, but I still think about it sometimes. Well, Simon Kuznets got his curve by coming up with a really very simple and yet interesting story about how over time, as an economy develops, we might see the Gini coefficient, which you notice is on the vertical axis, change. So we start with economic development on the left-hand side. Imagine there being a relatively poor economy, mainly agricultural, okay? But now move to the right, and the economy is developing. And maybe now we have some development, particularly in the industrial sector. And as a result, wages are higher in that sector. So the Gini begins to creep up because now there is a gap between the richer and the poorer workers. It keeps going until it reaches kind of a high point, an inflection point. And now as the economy continues to develop even more, now all of a sudden the inequality is not so great. There are fewer people in the agricultural sector. Their salaries might be going up because of that. There are more and more people who are doing work either in the industrial or the service sector. And so you can imagine a world in which inequality begins to fall. So it's kind of a phenomenon of development, that inequality simply tells you where you are in terms of this story. Seriously, it is a good story. It kind of gives you a certain insight of thinking about these things. You can look at different economies and see evidence of it. But when you look at particularly the developed economies in recent years, you see something a bit different. Okay? So here is the Gini coefficient, again on the vertical axis, over time for the United States, Great Britain, and the OECD, which is the Organization of Economic Cooperation and Development, basically the rich nations club. Okay? So the members include Western Europe, Canada, US, Japan, Australia. More recently, interestingly enough, they've let into the club Mexico and South Korea, a sign that those economies are developing. Okay? But simply look at the US, for example, and you can see we went from a Gini coefficient of about 0.3 in 1975, and it's climbed pretty steadily upwards up to the 0.37. Britain somewhat different in terms of when they shot up first, but again, the numbers wind up at the end pretty close to the US. And you can see it's not just those two economies. When you look at the club of richer economies, it's true for the OECD in general. Okay? So that's not what Mr. Kuznets' curve would predict, that you would see further inequality as these economies continue to grow over time. So a big question is, what's going on? Okay? Craig mentioned a little bit about, towards the end, about what I'll call conventional wisdom, or about not believing everything. And that's equally true in economics as it is in political science. So we knew collectively as economists that there was inequality. We knew the numbers were a little interesting in terms of their movement, but no one thought this was a big issue. A few guys did. One particularly big guy who tried to raise it was Paul Krugman, whose name I hope you recognize, has a column in the New York Times, wrote a really interesting article about this a few years ago for the New York Times Magazine, in which it was clear he saw this coming and was trying to figure out what was going on. But it really wasn't within my profession seen as a major issue until about a year ago. And I wish I had a photograph of the man I'm about to mention. I don't, but the name is Thomas Piketty. And Mr. Piketty is a French economist who, along with others, has been quietly working on the data on this subject. And a year or so ago, about a year and a half ago, he released a book in French originally called, I believe, Capitalism in the 21st Century. Okay, the 21st century. And an English version came out very quickly. And for a brief period of time, to the immense enjoyment of my profession, Mr. Piketty became kind of a superstar in terms of public notice. And his book became very widely commented on. The publication date of the English translation was moved up. And all of a sudden, people were talking about Mr. Piketty's work. What did he say? He said that the type of inequality that I illustrated a second ago, okay, on the slide, is something which indeed is true of advanced economies. His work really was on Europe, Western Europe to be precise, Britain, France, Germany, because those were the countries with the most data he could go back over time on, as well as on the United States. And his thesis was that this type of inequality is an inherent feature of capitalism. Okay? And he had a little story to try to justify it. So here's our one economic equation of the day. Okay? R represents, and this is Piketty's work, the rate of return received by the owners of capital. Profits, dividends, interest. If you had money working for you, you got something out of it. And that would be little r. G is the growth rate of the economy, the real economy growing over time. Not inflation, but really the economy's ability to produce goods and services. And Piketty believes that in general, R will exceed G. And as long as that is true, then the money received by the richer part of the capitalist society and the growth in that is exceeding the overall growth of the economy, which means that the richer people's incomes are growing faster than the rest of the economy. Okay? So that was his basic thesis. And he had data going back through the early 19th century to try to illustrate why that's been true in Britain and France and Germany. And I do want to put another plug in for reading his book. He really is a very, very smart guy, and he's a very nice writer. And one thing he does in the book, which is charming, is he goes to the novels of Mr. Balzac in French and Jane Austen in English, and talks about something which, when I say this, you'll say, well, of course, the importance of class in those books. So I'm not as familiar with the French novels of Mr. Balzac as I am with Jane Austen, but anyone who's read Pride and Prejudice right away knows that a big part of those books was how the women would achieve economic security. And how do you do it? You marry up. And so it's, it's a charming book, perhaps, and yet it's a very serious, sober message. This is how you escape poverty, was by moving up, by marrying someone richer, someone who was in that capitalist class, who was indeed receiving a substantial amount of money on their savings, on their treasury bonds of that time, what have you. Okay? So R greater than G. And you can see it goes back through the late 19th century up to 1928, and the number is going up over time. And then it falls during the 20th century. Why? Because we have these incredible events of World War I, the Great Depression, World War II, okay? And capital is destroyed, and governments are intervening in societies because of the wars of that period. And so there's a real change in income distribution in the advanced economies, and it becomes much more equal. The Gini Coefficients come down during that period. But then we hit post-World War II, and you can see that R begins to exceed G again and continues to do so up to the current day. And so Mr. Piketty's message is a rather sober one, and perhaps not a very optimistic one, which is that in general we would expect R to exceed G, the rate of return on savings to be greater than the growth of the economy, which means that the rich get richer and the poor don't get richer. The poor stay poor, okay, as well as those in the middle class. So that was his message. That was his basic message. And it really was something that all of a sudden exploded in the public consciousness. And all of a sudden, the economists began to pay more time, more attention on this issue. Okay? So that's the important insight number one, that inequality within countries, particularly the advanced, but not just them. We can talk about China as well, by the way, but certainly the advanced, because we have the data for them, has increased over time. There was a fluctuation in the 20th century because of the extraordinary events, but that's changed. Okay? So that's message number one. But I don't want you to walk away saying, therefore, inequality is growing around the world. Depends on how you define around the world. We could talk about global inequality. Okay? Up to now, I've been talking about national inequality within France, within Britain, within the United States. But how about stepping back and looking at the entire world? How has inequality been? Turns out there are different ways of trying to measure that. Okay? And a group of economists, starting with a man called Mr. Milovic, Bruno Minovec, I can look up the name for you afterwards, and some colleagues have been doing exactly this work. And so what did they do? Well, they go back to the Lorenz curve and they plot a Lorenz curve and then a Gini coefficient. But now it's not people, it's nations. How do you measure a nation's income? By some notion of average income. So now it's not people, these are the countries in a particular part of the world. And for each country, I get its average income. And then I line up exactly as before the countries now, not people, from the poorest country here to the richest country at the end. And I start plotting the Lorenz curve. And then from that, I get the Gini coefficient. When you do that exercise, you will see that inequality among countries was pretty stable, not a lot of movement in the Gini coefficient, and then began to increase around 1980 through the end of the century. So from that, you would say, well, countries are becoming more unequal over time. But there's a problem with that measurement. What did I just say? I took each country and lined it up by itself. Yeah, but suppose this country is twice as big as that country. Then it's a little misleading to treat them as the same. So what the people who have done this do, say, well, let's go a little step further. We'll get each country's average income, but when we plot it, we weight it somehow by population. When you do that, you get a slightly different picture. Again, things pretty stable 1960 to 1980, but after 1980, the Gini coefficient seems to fall. It actually begins to go down. So when you weight from population, it would seem that something began to happen in the 1980s that made the world a little more equal than it had been in the preceding period. So let me stop because I'm talking too much. Let me ask Jalina, is that how I pronounce it? What could have happened in the 1980s and 90s that might explain that development? And by the way, no one right answers, so whatever Jalina says is fine. What was going on in the world of the 1980s and 90s? And why, hint, do we notice it mostly when we weight by population? But if we ignore population, we don't see this. But as soon as we weight by population, we begin to see it.
Isn't there a population growth?
Actually, population began to slow down. Demographic growth began to slow down in some parts of the world.
I was going to say the rise of the internet age.
Rise of the internet age, although it was a little slow in the 1980s. Craig and I remember the internet. It wasn't all that much there at the time. Oh, Alice?
In China.
Thank you. It was the growth in terms of the economic power of China and India. And that's the hint. When you weight by population, guess what? Those are very important observations. So Alice, you're absolutely right. Okay? A third way of measuring it, which will give us a similar story, is to say, well, wait a minute. Why do we care about boundaries? We care about people. Let's go back and get all the people in the room. Forget about what your passport tells you. Tell us what your income level is. And now let's line them up from the poorest over there to the very richest over there. So the poorest might be someone in some area, I don't know, in Afghanistan, in some country in sub-Saharan Africa, wherever the poorest person would be. And way over there is what? Warren Buffett and Bill Gates and a bunch of Russian oligarchs, I don't know, whoever are the richest people in the world. When you do your Gini coefficient by using that methodology, two things. Number one, the Gini coefficient will be much larger than it would ever be for one country. Why? Well, think of what I just said. You're looking at the gap from the poorest person in the world to the very richest person in the world, and that gap is probably going to be a lot bigger than it would be within one country. Okay? But point number two, and I have to be careful, the data here are a little sketchy. We don't have that great data, particularly on the poorest peoples of the world. But again, there seems to be some decline in inequality, that the gap between Mr. Buffett and that poorest person may have fallen, which is consistent with the second bit of information I gave with you. Okay? So that might give you another way of thinking about inequality. That it's not just inequality within countries we should care about, and I'll come back to this point and allow you to tell me if you agree with this or not, okay? But just for the next slide or two, bear with me, okay? You might say, yeah, but it's another way of looking at it. That we can look at it in terms of countries. And when you weight by population, you see a slightly different picture. And when you simply look at people, and you look at it on a global basis, there seems to be some sign that inequality has fallen a bit from what it had been in previous decades. The third point I can show you even in more detail. It's kind of fun to see. So Mr. Milanovac kind of took this last point I raised with you, and here's another graph, which is a little bit about the Lorenz curve in the following sense. Look at the horizontal curve. It's percentiles of income distribution. So the same idea is lining people up from the poor to the rich. Only again, this is on a global basis. So the left-hand side is the very poorest group in the world, and the right-hand side is the very richest. But now the vertical axis is a bit different. It represents the change in income for each group of people between the years of 1988 and the year of 2008. So that 20-year period. Okay? So we can look at it, and you notice there's kind of a missing part here to the curve because the data wasn't very good when they did this part of it. But now let's start moving up to the first 5% of the population. And you see there was some increase in their income, about 15%. But now as we move along to the right, we start seeing that the increases in income begin to go up, go past 50, 60%. Roughly halfway through the income distribution, we see that we have the highest, my red dot all of a sudden disappeared on me. What am I doing wrong? I don't know. Oh, there it is. All of a sudden we have the highest amount. And then we have what? A huge plunge. And all of a sudden the numbers go down by a lot. Okay? So Sophia, what's that plunge that looks like a cliff? Why all of a sudden do we see that nice increases up there, which I will tell you represent the Chinese and the Indians and the Brazilians, by the way, and the Indonesians. So a lot of people in those countries are doing somewhat better. So those are the people we see with the nice big increase there. But then as we move up, all of a sudden things go down. It's down by a lot. Okay? So Sophia, who are those folks?
They would be the ones in between those in China and the other countries that you mentioned, and some of the rich.
And who would those be? The middle class in the United States and Europe, who don't see any change in their incomes during this period. So yes, the Chinese and Indian and Brazilian middle classes are doing much, much better, but not the middle classes in the countries of Europe and the US. And in fact, there is hardly any change. And now I would claim to you, that's why Mr. Trump and Mr. Sanders are doing so well, because the people in those countries who have not seen their incomes rise for that 20-year period, and now 30-year, by the way, are obviously not too happy about it. And then, of course, at the very end, all of a sudden, whoosh, there goes back up, and those are the very richest people in the richest economies. So those are the super millionaires or billionaires, I guess, in the US and Europe and other countries as well. Okay? So I wanted you to kind of work out with me what was going on. Let me show you another version of the same curve, annotated. So this version actually had a little bit of data at the very beginning for the richest, but it's not particularly encouraging. It's 0. So the very poorest are locked out of growth. Now we have the rising incomes in the emerging economies. Then indeed we have the developed the world middle class, and they're not doing very well. And finally we have the global elite who are doing very well, thank you very much, are doing just fine. Okay? So again, the story here is one in which it's mixed. You see some groups of the world doing better over this period, but other groups in other parts of the world not doing as well. So while within country Gini coefficients are important to understand, when you step back, you see kind of an interesting phenomenon, don't you, in terms of how people are doing around the world. Okay? So this is the basic, what I want you to see for the first part of my talk. Let's kind of get the big picture. Understand that you really have to think about how you define the area over which you are curious about inequality. And you really want to be very precise in how you define that, because your response as to what's going on will depend upon, well, tell me what you're interested in. If you're interested within countries, I have one set of data to give you. If you want to know about across countries, I have another set of data, and it's important to kind of understand the difference. Okay? All right. Alice, why did you say China and India before, correctly, by the way? Why in particular about them?
Because their economies have seen incredible growth.
And I'm going to follow up and ask her another question because that was such a good answer. Why do they see such enormous growth? You're absolutely correct, Alice.
For several reasons. So for China, partly
changes from policies that Chairman Mao put in previously.
But particularly in the 80s and 90s. So now we're past the periods of Mao. We're in the period of Mr. Deng. And all of a sudden, China's looking very different. And China is going to a country which is bought into globalization big time. Okay? So if you say to me, all right, explain that. Why is that true? Why do we see that the Chinas and Indias are doing so well, but the US and the Britain and France are not doing so well? One answer might be globalization itself. Maybe there's something inherent in globalization that explains why we have this type of phenomenon. Well, let me say a few words about that then, because you won't be amazed to hear this is a topic that a number of economists have done a lot of work on and are trying to figure out, is there something about globalization that affects inequality measured either within the countries or across the countries? And again, let me be very careful that I do kind of distinguish between the two. Okay? So here's the one typo on the slides that I saw last night at 10 p.m. and I was too tired to get up and fix it. So David Dollar and Art Cray were economists at the World Bank who in the year 2001, sorry, I'm off by a decade, in the year 2001 published a study, got a lot of notice. This thing was quoted all over the place. And what they did, which was very clever, was to take the developing nations and divide them into what they call the globalizers and the non-globalizers. And the globalizers were simply those that between the late 70s through the through the 90s rather, the late 1990s, so starting in the late 70s up through the late 1990s, had begun to export a lot more, had a lot more international trade. Okay? So that was their admittedly simplistic, but you got to start somewhere, definition of a globalizing nation. And then clearly the non-globalizers were those that did not do that. So we're taking all the developing nations and divide them into either one of two bins. You're either a globalizer or you're not. Okay? And then they decided to get some data on the rich economies as well. And what they showed was that if you looked at economic growth in the three groups of countries, that it's pretty clear that the globalizers did pretty well over the 1990s. Okay? Better, much better than the non-globalizers, even better than the rich nations. So that's your China, and that's your India, and that's those are countries that are beginning to do really well during this period. So that's nice about economic growth, but economic growth is an aggregate number for the entire economy. How about inequality? Well, again, you should say, but what type of inequality? Clearly, as the globalizers, developing nations do better than the rich nations, that affects the countries, okay? But how about within the countries? So Dollar and Cray were a pretty good economist in the sense that they had the same question. So they then also tested for the impact of this growth upon inequality, the Gini coefficient within each country. And they claimed that there was no impact, that inequality didn't get worse, didn't get better as the countries grew. So it was neutral in that sense. Okay? So they came up with a pretty good prognosis for globalization. Seemed to indicate that countries, in aggregate, could do better in terms of growth if you had globalization. And there was no negative impact within the countries. Okay? So again, this is 2001, a little while ago, 15 years ago. Comes after this great growth period of the 1990s. People are pretty optimistic about globalization. Okay? And yet there are a couple of doubters within my profession. And people are saying, I see those numbers. I'm not sure you're reading them the right way. Maybe it's not that globalization created growth. Maybe it's that growth led to more trade. That countries that are growing quickly for some reason, for some policy reason, are more able, have a bigger taste for imported goods. You can imagine all sorts of stories. And among the people who raised this very good question is Danny Roderick. Danny Roderick, a very, very good economist at the Kennedy School for a number of years. More recently has been at the Princeton Institute for Advanced Studies. And he's raised a very good point that, all right, I believe your data, but I can turn the story upside down, and all of a sudden then your policy implications are very different. Okay? So that's one story about globalization and inequality. More recently, a study done by 3 economists at the IMF talked about globalization and technology, which we're going to get into, and its effects on inequality. And the first thing they said, which a lot of other economists have agreed with, is that technology has had a greater effect on inequality than globalization. So we're going to talk about technology in about 5 minutes, but I just want to tell you up front that these guys think that's really important. Okay? Number two, globalization, they say, depends, that it has a mixed impact. So I use the term globalization. Okay? So we know that globalization is kind of a big phenomenon. So Sean, I know you're an expert on this. Tell us what type of things globalization includes. What does an economist mean by globalization?
When multinational companies go into other countries.
So that would be multinational companies, and that would be trade to the extent that these firms then ship goods across borders. So international trade is indeed one form of globalization. And Lillian, what's the other way that an economist such as myself might look at globalization? If it's not international trade, it might be. Louder, please.
Exchange of ideas.
Well, intellectual property ideas, yeah, but a little more simplistic than that. Money. So international finance. So think about both international trade and international finance, where trade are the goods and services. The finance is the money. So to get that multinational that Sean referred to operate in a country, there would have to be some initial money crossing borders. Okay, that's international finance. And then to the extent that they export goods, that would be the international trade. Okay? So what these guys said was that it makes a big difference when you talk about globalization as to what type of globalization you talked about. They made a very simple story that more trade led to less inequality. And again, it's one aspect of trade they referred to, a little narrow. I'll tell you what they talked about. They talked about the ability of people in countries that depended upon foreign food imports, that with globalization, that price might go down. So you're in a developing country, you're dependent upon not domestic farmers, but foreign farmers for some form of food. With more trade, maybe the price of the food goes down. That makes everyone better off, including the poorer people, if now food gets cheaper. On the other hand, they said that more foreign direct investment itself increases inequality. And the reason for that is that the foreign firm comes in and they do need people with a little bit of education. So right away, think about the Kuznets Curve. They're attracting people with a little more education who are able to do more sophisticated tasks. Those people do better than those who are not getting the job at the foreign factory. Okay? So let me stop here and talk about China. As I'm sure many of you know better than I, one of the most interesting aspects of looking at China in now the late 80s, the 1990s, the 2000s, is the migration of people from the rural areas inland to the coast to work at factories. And as they do so because they can make more money than if they stay on the farm. And that's fine for the individual, but China's Gini Coefficient, which is relatively flat, very equal at the time, begins to rise and rise and rise as we have this inequality between the coastal cities, which are doing very well, and the still relatively poor within-country rural areas. Okay? So that's why you would see inequality within those countries where the FDI is going to. Meanwhile, where did the companies leave? They left the US, they left Western Europe, they left Canada. Why? Because they could get cheaper wages in these other countries. That means they're firing off people who had the factory jobs. So it's like a double blow. On the one hand, you're making inequality worse in the countries you go to by hiring people, which is good, but of course they do better than others. At the same time, you're letting people off in the richer countries, so they're sinking down. Both of those developments will lead to more inequality. So that's their story about foreign direct investment and why FDI by itself would increase inequality. Okay. Third study I just want to mention is one that just came out by, again, two IMF economists, and they talked in particular about international capital, about money. And they were pretty direct about this, okay, and said that international capital flows in their results definitely do increase inequality. In particular, what it does is to reduce labor's share of income. And so when they look at these countries that receive the foreign money, that you do see more inequality afterwards. Okay? They claim that when the countries already have strong domestic institutions, they can handle the foreign money a bit better, so it's not as strong an impact. On the other hand, when you have countries with financial crises, which by the way was certainly the emerging markets of the 1990s, the Mexicos, the East Asian economies, the Russia, the Brazils, that inequality got worse following those crises. Okay? So pretty much a mixed bag. Pretty much a mixed bag. Okay? So if you were to step back and say to me, so what about it? Does globalization make inequality better or worse? I'm going to do a typical economist thing and say it depends. I'm sorry, but I can't give you a straight, flat-out sentence, thumb up or thumbs down. Okay? It does help those countries that were able to jump in the 1980s and 90s and start engaging in more trade. Those countries gain more, and that's why you see the countries doing better. Okay? Allowed them to raise growth rates. But it probably also led to inequality within those countries. So that's a domestic issue. Okay? And I will tell you, I think these days it would be hard for a poor country to copy what China, Korea, go back in history, Japan did in the last century. That those opportunities might not be there for India, might not be there for sub-Saharan Africa. They might have to do things using services, which is a different way of growing. It isn't clear yet just how successful that will be for India's. Okay? I just find it fascinating, though, to read about the call centers in Africa and how those are growing. And so who knows, that might be one way of those countries growing a bit. Okay? So all I'm saying is that if anybody tells you globalization will solve the world's problems, they're wrong. In my eyes, if somebody says globalization is the source of the world's problems, I'd say hold on there. That's a little bit of a strong statement. That it really depends on how it's done. And how it's done can differ and can either be helpful or not so helpful for those countries. Okay? So that's the research most recently on globalization and whether or not it's good or bad. Got to say a few words about technology. So there's my favorite slide of the day. I have no idea what the machine is doing, but it just looked really cool when I saw it last night. So I thought, well, why not? We'll throw it up there. So I mentioned before that economists, by and large, think that technology has been much more a source of inequality within countries. Okay? Again, particularly the advanced economies. Why? Shouldn't technology be a good thing for us? Why would it be bad? Sarah, isn't technology good?
It can replace some of the jobs.
So the thing about technology is, on the one hand, it may indeed make society more productive. And so in terms of the ability to workers to produce goods, which is one measure of productivity, that you would say that, yeah, it does make society better off. Okay? And we certainly see that in the US. One simple mini example. My wife's on the West Coast, and what little I know about farming is going to visit her family in the Central Valley of California, which is a fascinating place to see if you're like me, a New Yorker who's never been out there. It's a huge agricultural area. And one thing which is very noticeable as you drive mile after mile is how few people you see. Every once in a while, you'll see some huge machine that looks like something out of Star Wars. And there'll be one person in a cab driving it. And they're doing something to the land, which in South Asia might be a family or a group of families doing by hand. So technology allows people on an individual basis maybe to do things more productively, okay? And society should be better off as a result of that, okay? But does everybody share in those benefits? And the answer is probably not, okay? So yeah, growth should go up, but people experience that growth in different ways. The people who figure out the new ways of using technology are going to be the ones who are going to do the best. So that certainly would be the Bill Gates, and Mr. Zuckerberg, and Facebook. Those guys make a lot of money, no question about it. Okay? So certainly in this country, the phenomenon of people going out to Silicon Valley and coming up with the latest app to get a car ride or something like that and making money that way. Everybody knows those stories, huh? One mini story, just in my time here, I know Craig remembers this, but I would say 15 years ago, the number, at least of my majors going to Wall Street was incredible. Everybody was going there. That's not true. It's not true now. And more of my econ majors are going to technology sector. It's very clear that that's where the action is going, okay? So you see that. So obviously those guys at the top make the most money. So Zuckerberg just said he's given away how much money, some amount which is just inconceivable to a human mind, okay? Those of us who can use technology in our work lives benefit. So when Craig and I first came to Wellesley, if we had an exam, we might write it out on a yellow piece of paper, walk up to the department secretary, be very respectful, and then say, could you please type this for us? and then wait till we ever came up in the queue. Now, of course, we go on our word processor and simply type one up and copy it, and there it is. Okay? So we use technology. We know how to do it. But those who don't have the skills or the knowledge to use technology, what are you going to do with them? What are you going to do? You're going to tell them to retrain? Okay, you can retrain. It's harder to do, quite bluntly, when you're older, like me. It's harder to do when you have a family and you're stuck somewhere, okay? You guys can, for example, when you graduate, go to wherever you have the best job opportunities. If it's California, so be it. If it's Mumbai, so be it. Off you'll go, okay? But if you're 40, 50 years old and you have children and they're in school, you can't simply jump to another city. It's harder, okay? So retraining gets to be conceivable. Yeah, we can talk about it, but it is indeed a little harder to do. One mini story about this. As a kid growing up in New York City, for me, a treat was when my father would take us to go over to Manhattan, and we might go to an office building. And I remember as a very young child going into the elevator, and at the elevator would be the elevator man. And that would be a person, always a man, okay? And he would say to you, what floor? And you would tell him. And then the other people would tell him. And then he would manually close the door of the elevator and then hit a button or something. He wouldn't hit a button, I'm sorry, he would have a lever. And he would use that to bring us up to the floor. He'd open the door and we'd walk out, okay? That's the world of the mid-1950s. There were still elevator men. Come back 10 years later, no more elevator men, okay? Obviously now it's all been done through having technology simply have higher levels of elevators and you just push a button. Question, where'd they go? Where'd the elevator men go? Did they retrain in some technological field and go out and make a lot more money? Probably not. What they probably did was to retire early and live on Social Security, I'm guessing. Okay? That's what I mean. That yes, of course it's easy for you and me to walk into an elevator, hit button, off we go. Okay? But someone lost a skill when we got that nice thing. And so while society should be able to compensate the losers, it doesn't always. It doesn't always. Okay? So that's all I want to say about technology. This in itself is a huge field within economics. Lots of very smart people trying to figure out where technology is taking us. Okay? So I'll just simply say I'm condensing a lot of very complicated work in a very one slide. Okay? So I've done a lot of talking. Let me stop and ask you a very hard question. If I said what are the costs of inequality, every hand would go up. And I'm going to ask that question in a minute. But I'm going to ask a tougher question. How might you talk about, maybe not the benefits, that might be too strong, but how might you justify a world of inequality? How might you say that, yeah, all right, all the data we've seen today is true about within countries, inequality seems to be going up in most countries. How might you say, yeah, but maybe that's not quite as bad as we might think? How might you justify it? Sanam, you want to take a shot at that? And again, when we have now we will have the microphones, please, because I do want to hear your answers to this question. And let's seriously now, there is no one right answer. So you really got to think this one through. So let's ask Sanam to get us started.
I think that perhaps a way in which one might be able to justify inequality is to say that it's a natural outcome of rapid industrialization, and that in the process of bringing a society up, it's something that may inevitably happen and occur.
So it simply is what it is. It's inevitable. I want someone to go further. Tell me something positive. You pass it? That's Savitri, I think? Yes. Savitri, tell me something positive. She makes it sound like an outcome, and yeah, all right, Sanam, you're right. And that's consistent with what I said. I'm not disagreeing. But come on, give me a little more.
Well, as an example, looking back to China, for example, in your data, we saw a Gini coefficient of 0.35 or something. I think nowadays is even higher, like 0.48. And when you look at the reasons for social unrest in China, it's usually never for inequality. And the reason is because most people don't feel that inequality within their families, within their neighbors, because they're all doing better, which is what you said. And so kind of like a positive thing is people, like inequality means more incentives for people to work harder sometimes. And, they see people at the top of the ladder just getting that more money. But I think at some point people do feel that they have the opportunity of doing better, and they feel it within their own sphere, even though the inequality is increasing.
So Savitri said the magic word to an economist, incentive. Thank you, Savitri. That maybe you need incentives to both firms and individuals to innovate sure, Bill Gates has more money than you and I could ever imagine, but gosh, he invented Windows, which I think is a good thing. There might be some debate over that. But I think most people would say that, yeah, at least at the time, it was seen as a really powerful tool for personal computing that certainly made lives a lot easier. So yes, that would be a very basic justification. That it's not just an outcome, it's even more, it's something that leads to the good result of having more output in society and general growth for everybody. So sure, I'm not doing as well as Bill Gates, but I'm doing better because of this growth. China, the US, what have you, and as a result, people are willing to accept it. So that would be one powerful answer. So why don't we get a mic over here to Rebecca on this side. You know there's more white space, so that means there are more answers besides the ones you've heard.
Okay. One of the possible benefits or justifications would be that it restructures the economic world order, and that in the sort of but the way that you've outlined it here, it's been more money moving into other countries. And so what we might see is that countries like China or Brazil or India will have more of the money, and then eventually they will have this sort of N-shaped curve where other people in their countries, the standard of living is raised, and it will sort of shift how we see the world and who has the most power.
Very good, Rebecca. I think that's very consistent with some of Craig's stories about there being a movement over time, okay? Certainly within the world that I live in terms of economic international governance, there's no question that countries like China are taking on a bigger and bigger role within, for example, the IMF, the World Bank, what have you. Why? Because they're richer. And having money means something at the table. And so when you have more money as a country, you demand a larger voice. I hope you all realize that at one point in history, China and India were indeed relatively affluent economies vis-a-vis the rest of the world. Then we went through a long process of industrialization, and now all of a sudden it might be that things are being reversed. So this might be seen as one way of saying, yeah, there's inequality, but in a sense, now the movement is towards those countries that were poorer off. Maybe China has a problem within China of inequality, but maybe a lot of Chinese people would say, as long as we catch up with the rest of the world, we're willing to, at least for now, go through this inequality within our country. That's about a powerful story to be told, I guess, on the political as well as economic side. So that's very good, Rebecca. That's not on my slide. It's going to next time I do this. Let's get a thing over here to Kim.
One of the benefits of inequality might be the fact that rich people have more disposable income. Therefore, they can save more, and their savings allows us to increase investment, and therefore we see macroeconomic growth.
So even Warren Buffett can't spend everything he has, so he has to save some of it, which means there's more available for investment, and higher income being more likely to save. Congratulations, you are on the slide. Therefore able to finance investment. It's a story. All I'm saying is a story that you hear. Okay? And finally, the last thing, and I'll say this for you, okay, that even when you say, you know, I'm still not convinced about all this, I think a lot of people, at least in this country, say what really counts is not so much the outcome as opportunity. Whoops, sorry. Ooh, go back. There we go. Equality of opportunity is more important than equality of outcome. Of course, that begs the question, do we have equality of opportunity? And as soon as you raise the question, you go, don't think so. Don't think so. Okay? So, but nonetheless, that would be an answer. Okay? So now let's flip it over. What are the costs of inequality? Why might you say, yeah, there's some problems here? Yeah, it sounds great that, you know, we have things like Windows and Facebook, but maybe a world in which those founders have as much money as they have not be such a great idea. So who wants to start off with the reason why we might be unhappy about this? Sartu, can I ask you for one?
Yeah, sure.
And we can make you a microphone? There's one right next to you. Good.
One cost of inequality could be that there is a portion of the population that is not able to be a contributor.
Yep.
And
as a result, society is not being as productive as it could be. Very good, Sartu. In fact, you get the prize for the first bullet point. Okay? That inequality itself lowers growth. And we have enough data going back to compare Latin America, which historically has been much more unequal than, say, Asia. And it's very clear that the Asian economies have done better over time than Latin America. Not every period, but over time. Okay? Certainly when you have a group of people who feel excluded from the benefits of growth, they're not going to be able to, in a sense, participate. And they may have things they could do, but they can't because they don't have the minimal skills needed. So certainly a world in which there's inequality might be a world that's not growing as fast. There's actually been a lot of work on this point, and it's pretty clear this is true. What Sartu said is true. Okay? A lot of work coming out of the World Bank and the IMF. That inequality costs you. It costs you in terms of you don't have as much growth as you otherwise would. Okay? So that's one powerful economic argument. Now, I'm not the political scientist in the room, but there's some other arguments which are political. Before I turn to Craig, I'm going to say, anybody want to take a crack at another reason why this might not be so good for society?
I think another cost of inequality could be the impact of inequality on equal rights and equal power in a country or an economy.
So certainly if the money isn't divided up, political power is not divided up. Okay? So inequality could undermine good policy. Government policies, as much as we like to think we're a democratic society, really do reflect the agenda of the richer parts of society. That's true in this country, God knows. Okay? But I suspect it's true in just about every country. Okay? So when you have inequality, not everybody has an equal voice at the table. That means that government policies are more shifted towards those who have the money to buy influence. And you obviously can say, is that the best for society? And again, when you raise the question, you can guess what the answer is going to be, maybe not. Okay? In fact, now I want to take that point, which as you can see I had, very good. You guys are sharp, huh? And kind of go one step further. Okay? So we don't have policy being articulated for all of society. Instead, it's for those who have more access to policymakers. And therefore, what? Give me one more political.
Well, I'm guessing like inequality can lead to violence or resistance.
It leads to discontent. So I don't have violence on my slide, but next time I do this, I will, because I like what you just said. It certainly, in a more simple terms, leads to less civic participation. And push it 1, 2, 3 steps further, it's not just less participation, it's violence, it's alienation, it's simply people opting out because of their anger at how society is structured. So to go back to where I began, it's not a coincidence that a socialist is getting a lot of voice in the Democratic Party, and a businessman who claims that he's not a politician but knows how to get things done is getting a lot of support in the other party. So luckily we're not at violence yet, and yet you can see the polarization that's going on just within this country. Very good. Okay? So you guys did a nice job. You saw, did I tell you this already? Or so everything I had, all the slides that you saw coming. So that's really great. So let's spend the last 5 minutes about, presidential campaigns. Okay? Policies to lower inequality. So I'll give you a few and then allow you all to say something. Right? I'm simply telling you what other, the mainstream justification is. And that is that social spending should be less on the older and the rich and more on the poor and the young. In this country, for example, there's going to be a lot more discussion about pre-K, pre-kindergarten, because we realize it's a very important period of life. So my children went to the Wellesley College Child Study Center. It's a fabulous institution. Tiny classes, a lot of attention, they blossomed. Other kids don't get to do that. So already at the age of 3, 4, and 5, you can see the difference in terms of educational outcome for children. Okay? You want to promote education. You certainly want to promote gender equality. Now, I haven't said anything about gender. That's partly because next week Anna Ravenga is going to be here from the World Bank. And as Joanne said yesterday, she literally wrote the report on gender inequality. So she can do this much better than I ever could. Okay? But as you can imagine, it's important. Okay? Reform the tax systems. In this country, the US, back in the 1970s and 80s, we lowered tax rates because we thought they were too high and destroyed incentives. Within the last couple of years, President Obama has pushed back on that, and tax rates have gone up on the higher levels of income. So there's a bit of a pendulum there in terms of policy going one way or the other. Create jobs. If you want to really help people, give them a job. You'd be amazed how happy that makes them. Okay? And yet that seems to be a source of mystery to people in this country, to politicians. And I would add something, eliminate corruption. Because that's certainly in my understanding, particularly in a lot of other countries. I'm not saying it's not true in the US, be careful, I didn't say that. I simply say in other countries it's at a different magnitude than we have in this country as well. It's at least inequality. So I'll put that on the screen because you'll read about it. Go back to my first slide. Question? I don't know how effective those won't be. I don't know if there's any chance we'll see them. I'm sure you'll hear more about this going forward. If Secretary Clinton becomes the presidential nominee, I'm sure she'll talk about this. On the Republican side, there is an interesting little split. Senator Marco Rubio of Florida does talk about middle income tax cuts as opposed to some of the other candidates. So it's there, it's in the water. People are talking about these things. And you'll hear a lot more about this, going forward than we have now. Okay? So we have a few minutes, obviously, for questions. Craig, did you want to add anything, though? Because I very much wanted to give you a chance to chime in on the last 2 points about the benefits of the cause.
The only thing that
Could we give him yeah, please.
The only thing that I would add, and it's Piketty, and it's really back to Jane Austen. It's another why growth would decline. It's that, but at the upper part of the income. If he's right, we're moving into a world in the industrialized countries where the incentives for not the 1%, but for the 1 to 9% become peculiar incentives where it becomes better to marry well than it is to do really well in a job. And if you believe that, a lot of the people in the 1 to 9% are people who are highly qualified and good and sensible and blah, 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 the incentives are going to be to try to marry well rather than to try to do something. So it undermines meritocracy. It undermines a system where people at the top are being used usefully within the society as a whole.
Big topic, marriage and who you marry. And that clearly in the last couple of decades in this country has been a trend where people are stratified in terms of who they marry. Years ago, you'd marry someone maybe you met in high school, when people married younger, and high schools were more democratic. Now we're all getting married older. I think I can say, Craig wouldn't mind, that both she and I have wives who are fairly well educated. We love them, but they're also very well educated, and instead we met them because of that type of sorting. That's the type of world we live in. Okay? That clearly is a factor out there. In this country, I know, because people have been doing the research on that. Okay? We have 10 minutes before I answer questions, which I'm happy to. Let me just say one word about this morning. Very much on the first part of the program, I try to bring in big picture stuff. So I really appreciate Craig giving us a big picture look at international governance, which will affect your reading of things that have been done for the particular goals that you're looking at. So you might have a better view about, where are these ideas coming from. Similarly, my talk on inequality. I just want to give you kind of the big picture look at it, okay? And then clearly you'll look at more specific examples of inequality going forth. So that really was what we wanted to do this morning. I'll mention tomorrow morning, Professor Larry Rosenwald is coming in, and he talks about globalization and the humanities. Again, big picture. The next week you'll get more, more granular. You'll go down to lower levels. So we're not trying to overwhelm you with facts today, but very much I wanted Craig, and I appreciate his doing it, and in my talk to kind of give you a lot of overview that then you will build upon within your own particular stuff. Okay? I think we have about 10 minutes for questions, Joanne. So I can't. Mackenzie. Thank you, Mackenzie.
Thank you so much for this.
I guess one of my questions is about the rhetoric that you used when talking about technology. You spoke of winners and losers.
Yeah.
And to me, that implies that we're working within a system of competition. And I wonder how much that kind of rhetoric affects the actual economic impact or systems that we have. And I wonder kind of your opinion.
Yeah, so that's a good point. There need not be losers if you have a system in which the winners can compensate those who don't have the same gains as they do. In that type of world, okay, everybody would be better off. Not maybe to the same extent, but everybody would be better off. Those of you who have done philosophy certainly may know about John Rawls and his views on this. So what I'm giving you is very much the rhetoric of a world where that does not happen, for whatever reason, political, who knows, okay? So there are losers only because society is structured not to share the benefits equally. And can we imagine a society where we do share the benefits? Sure we can. Sure we can. And that's going to be part of the political debate, I suspect, in the year coming. That you will hear a debate between, no matter who the candidates are on the two sides, talk about somehow sharing the benefits. There'll be very different visions about how to do that. And so you'll be interested to see how that same idea can be articulated in very different ways. But you're right, to say winners and losers assumes something. I'll say it assumes the reality, but you're right to say, but it could be a different reality. And maybe that's something we should keep in mind as we talk about this. Good point, thank you. Other points? Do we have a microphone up? Yeah, there we go. Sophia?
Believe that some of the policies that need to be put in place and technological advances for climate change will increase inequality within nations?
The short answer is I don't know enough about those proposals to give you a really informed answer. The extent that those policies do, though, if possible, technically, to slow down the impact of global climate change, they would actually benefit. They would lower inequality. It seems to be pretty clear that the countries that will suffer the most are those along the equator. Those are the poorer, generally, countries. So anything that could be done to mitigate or hold back the impact of climate change on them from a global point of view would actually improve the global inequality issue. That would be my view. How about, Sophia, would you pass it up to Amy?
On your global income growth graph. So the year it stopped was in 2008, or that's where you measured, which is a particularly interesting year to measure things for the middle class. So I'm wondering, for one, would that have looked different in 2005? And now that we've gone through somewhat of a recovery, what you would think it would look like now in 2016?
Very, very good point. The only reason I think he stopped there was because he was doing the work in 2010, and that was the latest year, okay? But that really is a 20-year average. So if you lop off the last 3 years, I know you're thinking about the crisis, and I understand that. I don't think the basic trend would be any different. I think we're still seeing the gap between the income growth in the global middle class and the less income gained by the middle class of the advanced economies. What's happened in the last couple of years, we don't obviously know the data fully yet, but certainly I would say that a lot of that growth in the global middle class is going to fall. That when I think about countries like Brazil, that those countries are going to be slowing down a lot. So some of the gains that were made by those countries, if we consider it as a country weighted by population, I don't think you're going to see repeated. Okay? So if you redo this in 10 years and you have enough data and enough time to change the averages, and you might see a different picture. So Amy, you're right to kind of wonder about what's happened in the last couple of years. Again, I can't give you anything definitive, but something's going on as these countries, Russia all of a sudden going through a second year of a recession, Brazil going through a downturn. Clearly that's going to affect income inequality across countries. Would you pass Michelle's hand up next? And then Alice will go back to you.
When you were talking about the Piketty explanation, so let's think of it as the whole world is a big economy and each country become an individual in that economy.
Yeah.
So do you think that this explanation still holds true? Thinking of China start very poor at the bottom of the economy growth and national development. However, until now, China surpassed the US in terms of GDP. So it doesn't seem true to me that the poor stay poor. It's like the poor stay.
Well, what a Chinese economist would immediately say is the difference between gross domestic product, which is the aggregate level of output, versus GDP per capita. And that China has a few more people than the United States. So it may be that their economy is up to our economy in terms of aggregate size. They would certainly point out, yeah, but when you look at individual income, that they're a lot further behind the US. The second point, which, as an economist, I should add, there's this quality of life. I've been in Beijing. I've seen the pollution. It's awful. And, everybody knows that. And so, yeah, the economy might be getting richer on one level, but I think the Chinese leadership is well aware of the fact that their own people are unhappy with the quality of life. So it would be perfectly fair to say, fine, everything you said, okay, but haven't you left out something very important? Can you literally survive if you ignore environmental degradation? And I certainly would understand someone saying you can't ignore that, and I agree you can't ignore it. I think that I'm not a political scientist, I don't know a lot about China. My reading is that the Chinese government is well aware of the fact that there are people who are unhappy about this and feel that maybe they can make a bargain, that maybe growth will slow down, but there'll be a better or less bad, I'm not quite sure which way it goes, environmental situation. Okay? So that would be my guess about it. So why don't we have the last question from Alice over here?
Wanted to follow up on Amy's question about financial crises, especially in relation to the arguably inequality of recovery from the 2008 financial crisis. So in your view, do you think the financial system as well as monetary policymakers have a responsibility to account for the negative externalities the financial system brings both domestically and globally?
So Alice, it just so happens that on the blog that Crystal mentioned, I posted something this week on can we ever limit financial risk? So you raise a very good point, and it'll be another lecture to really give you the answer I would like to. I'm going to spare you that. But the answer is that we know that, and this is where I end the thing, that there are people with a vested interest in the financial system evolving. And when you talk about new types of financial instruments, derivatives and all these kind of things that we talk about, who makes the decision over whether or not to have them? In an ideal society, it'd be one who weighs the potential benefits with the cost to society. Okay? So that would be some very wise decision maker, John Rawls I mentioned before, someone who looks at the big picture. Unfortunately, in the real world, it's going to be a bunch of Wall Street lobbyists who give money to the PAC, the political action campaign of a congressman, who then pushes what the answer is. And I literally am more worried about that aspect of this than the other parts that I've talked about, okay? Because I see those decisions as being skewed, very badly skewed. And in fact, I was going to tell Greg at lunch today, I was just reading a book by a fellow in Germany about exactly this issue, how the whole international regulatory system, and you know this better than I do, is very much weighted towards those who have a voice. And guess what? Those who have a voice are those who have the money to pay for the lobbyists.
That's the big political downside to inequality within society. I mean, it really is the huge.
Yeah. So Alice, you're right to wonder about it. It is indeed a danger. Okay. I can't say anymore. My voice is dead. So Joanne.
So please join me